Is your hand really your hand? Rene Descartes' radical doubt and skepticism versus G. E. Moore's defense of common sense and proof for the existence of the external world. Look down at the appendages at the end of your arms. Most of us would glance down and say, "Oh look, there's my hands." Hands are going to feature fairly prominently in this video, so be sure to keep them in mind. To go back a few seconds, I said that most of us would glance down and identify our hands, but not necessarily everyone. The beauty and the challenge of philosophy is the ability to muse upon and to call into question all sorts of things. One of these things may even be the existence and/or the reality of our own body. All of this falls under the category of epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge. Epistemology wrestles with questions like, what is knowledge? What do you quote-unquote know? Once we've established that, then what types of knowledge are authentic, and which are not? What sources of knowledge can you trust, and of which should you be suspicious? Into this epistemological fray wandered George Edward Moore. He was an English philosopher who lived from 1873 to 1958. He was a professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge and is considered one of the three founders of analytic philosophy, along with Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Moore published Proof of an External World in 1939. In this work, he hoped to prove the objective existence of the outside world using, you guessed it, his hands as an example. One of his most famous quotes comes right from the beginning of this work. I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands, and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left hand, and here is the other. However, we've already gotten ahead of ourselves. Before we dig too deeply into this quote, and Moore's larger proof, we actually have to set up the context of his epistemology. To do so, we have to go back 300 years to Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes was a French philosopher who lived from 1596 to 1650. He is considered by many as the founder of modern philosophy. Regardless of what one may think of Descartes, his effects on Western philosophy are still felt to this day. Descartes lived and wrote on the cusp of what would be the Enlightenment. So much of what Westerners thought they knew was now being called into question. The sphericity of the earth, its place in the universe in relation to the sun, the very nature of God and his religion, the foundations of the physical sciences, all of these were now being called into question. Within this milieu, Descartes published his Meditations on First Philosophy in 641. He is seeking to find the one incontrovertible truth that can serve as the foundation of all knowledge. He proposes the method of radical doubt. Anything that can possibly be doubted should be so. To develop this, he employs two tools, the dream conjecture and the evil genius. He finally arrives at his conclusion and his most famous quote, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes early on questions the veracity of the sensible world. He muses on this in the beginning of Meditation 1 by reflecting on, you guessed it again, his hands. He writes, can I deny that these hands and this body are mine, save perhaps by comparing myself to those who are insane? Yet that is exactly what he is going to go on to do. Descartes then quickly moves into his dream conjecture. He notes that he is sitting in his chair, dressed and writing. He also acknowledges that many times he has dreamed of sitting in that chair working, when in reality he had been laying undressed in his bed peacefully dreaming. It is only upon waking that he realized that he had been in a dream, and that all the time he had spent sitting in the chair was not real. Descartes poses the point, can we 100% undoubtedly prove that we are not dreaming at this moment? And if we are dreaming, then the hand we see is not actually our real hand, but rather a dream hand. So when I look down at the appendage at the end of my arm, what I am really seeing is not my hand. How many times do we think we see something only to realize that it's not what we thought we saw? Or that there's nothing there at all, and we only quote-unquote saw phantoms? How many times have we thought we heard something to find out it wasn't what we thought we heard? Descartes settles on one of his major points. We cannot trust our senses, and all sense data is suspect. In Meditation 2 of his work, Descartes points out that while he can doubt his senses, and both mathematical and metaphysical principles, he cannot doubt his own existence. He has to exist in order to think and to doubt things. He ends up conceiving of his mind as existing, but of bodies as not existing. This leads to Descartesian dualism, and the idea that our minds are distinct from our bodies. This is not to be confused with the idea of body and soul that we find in Aristotle, and much more concretely in Christian theology and scholastic philosophy. Rather, the idea that what we perceive to be our physical body may not necessarily be us, and the only thing that I can truly trust to be me is my mind. This now brings us back to G.E. Moore. It is in the overall context of this Cartesian dualism, this concept of our mind being the only reliable reality and everything external to it being doubted, that Moore lays out his epistemological views. A major work of his was The Defense of Common Sense, first published in 1925 and reprinted in 1959. In this work, he seeks to defend what he calls a common sense approach to epistemology and metaphysics over the super-skeptical bend of modern and contemporary philosophy. In his own words, he explains, "In what follows, I have merely tried to state, one by one, some of the most important points in which my philosophical position differs from positions which have been taken up by some other philosophers." Moore begins his essay with 2 points. In the first, he pens a list of truisms that Moore says he knows with full certainty to be true. There exists at present a living human body, and that body is my body, mine meaning Moore's. This body was born at a certain time in the past, and has existed continuously ever since, though with changes. He points out that he was much smaller when he was born, and was small for most of his life as he progressed from childhood to adulthood. Ever since it was born, it has been either in contact with or not far from the surface of the earth, and at every moment since it was born, there have also existed many other things, having shape and size in 3 dimensions, from which it has been at various distances. Moore uses the example of the bookshelf and the mantelpiece in the room in which he is writing. He points out the bookshelf is farther away from him than the mantelpiece. Also, there have, very often, at all events, existed some other things of this kind with which it was in contact. Moore uses the example of the clothes he is wearing, and the pen with which he is writing. Moore continues his list of truisms. Among the things which have, in this sense, formed part of its environment, there have, at every moment since its birth, been large numbers of other living bodies. Each of these living bodies has, just like it, at some time been born, continued to exist some time after birth, been, at every moment of its life after birth, either in contact with or not far from the surface of the earth, and many of these bodies have already died and ceased to exist. But the earth had existed also for many years before my body was born, and for many of these years also a large number of human bodies had, at every moment, been alive upon it, and many of these bodies had died and ceased to exist before it was born. Finally, to summarize his final point on the list, he's a human being. At different times since he was born, he's had many different experiences. There are things he's known and things he's not known. He's had dreams. He's had feelings of many different kinds. And, just as his body has done this, so all other human beings have done the exact same thing and had the exact same experiences. This then leads us into point 2 and the main crux of Moore's argument. Almost all people, at most times, have agreed with all the propositions in point 1 and have known them to be certainly true. Basically, most humans would agree with Moore rather than Descartes. In the beginning of this video, when I asked you to look at the appendages at the end of your arms, I guarantee most of you did not say, "These may possibly be my real hands if I'm not dreaming, and am not being deceived by my senses." Rather, you looked and said, "These are my hands." Most of us instinctually and automatically agree with More's view, not Descartes'. So where does this leave us? I believe the basic premise for More is that his stance is the common sense stance. Most people, across the entirety of human history, agree with him. Further, the skeptics' claims have fairly shaky foundations, and an uphill battle in terms of convincing people they are correct. For 2,000 years before Descartes, most of Western philosophy agreed with More. The skeptics don't successfully and completely knock down those theories, and, if we're going to be completely honest, the burden of proof is on the skeptics, not on the realists. The realists were here first, and for much longer. More says that you can know just as much about material objects outside of yourself as you can know about your own body, and about your own mental states. More's view is known as direct realism. Descartes, of course, is not a direct realist, because he says that we know that we have hands by making an inference from facts about experience. These then lead to facts about the external world. Whereas the direct realist says that no such inference is required. We start with knowledge of the objects, just as we start with knowledge of our mental states. The trouble with direct realism, some may say, is that when we are challenged to say how we know that we have hands, we say things like, "I know because I see them." The rightness of this sort of response might suggest that it is the right response. But the direct realist says that you should say something completely different, something to the effect that you just know. You just know that you have hands non-inferentially, in the way that you know you have mental states. To come back to our previous point, it's just common sense. Does More successfully refute Descartes? Skeptics would say no. Those who hold tightly to Cartesian dualism, absolute skepticism, and the general distrust of the outside world found in modern and contemporary philosophy would simply state that More proved nothing, and certainly failed to disprove their philosophical thought of choice. But More does succeed in raising interesting opposing points and calling us back to a common-sense approach to epistemology and greater philosophical questions in general. His works raise the point that Descartes and the skeptics aren't necessarily true, and the Aristotelians and the scholastics and the realists are not necessarily false. So, dear viewer, is your hand really your hand?